Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video, commenting where you're watching from and at what time, and subscribing to keep these chilling stories coming. Now, let's dive into these unsettling tales. It was a cold, icy night in late December. The weather in Texas doesn't usually get this bad, but that evening, everything had changed. A cold front had swept in, and the roads were covered in a thick sheet of ice. I was on my way to visit some family for Christmas, but with all the cars backed up on the main highways, I decided to take a back road shortcut to save time. At first, everything was fine. My old Honda wasn't the best car for icy roads, but I figured I could manage. I had the radio on low, the heater blasting, trying to make the best of it. The road ahead had some sharp bends, but I knew the area well enough to take it slow. But as I turned a corner, I saw it. The road ahead was slick. The kind of slick where you can feel the tires start to lose traction even before you realize it. I tried to slow down, but it was too late. The back end of the car started sliding, and suddenly I was no longer in control. My heart skipped a beat as the car skidded sideways. I yanked the steering wheel, trying to correct, but the ice had me. I felt my stomach drop as the car left the road and slid into a ditch, the impact knocking my head into the headrest. The world spun for a moment, and then silence. I sat there, dazed, trying to collect myself. My hands were shaking as I looked around, half expecting the car to be more damaged than it was. But everything seemed fine, just the cold, dead quiet of the winter night. My headlights illuminated the white, frozen trees on the edge of the ditch, and I realized I wasn't alone. Across the ditch, I saw something strange. There was another car. It looked like an old sedan, much like mine, but it had clearly been in an accident, its front end crumpled and the bumper hanging loosely. The driver's side window was rolled down, and I could just make out the faint outline of the driver's seat. Something about it didn't seem right. I hesitated. If someone else had crashed here too, they might need help. Maybe they were hurt or stranded. I had to check. I cautiously opened my door, trying to keep my balance on the slick ground, and walked toward the wreck. As I got closer, my heart began to race. The car was empty. The door on the driver's side was ajar, and there was no sign of the driver. No blood. No belongings scattered on the ground. The seat was pushed back, but there was nothing unusual except for how still everything was. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Why would someone leave their car like that? Had they gone for help? Why didn't they just call 911? Then, out of nowhere, I heard something. A rustling, a soft shuffle of footsteps. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I turned around slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and that's when I saw him. He was standing a few feet away, just beyond the wreck, staring at me. He looked wrong. His clothes were ragged, as if he'd been out there for hours, maybe longer. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. His expression was blank, but his gaze was fixed on me, like he was waiting for an opportunity. I took a step back, instinctively. "Are you okay?" I called out, trying to break the tension. My voice cracked slightly as I spoke. He didn't answer. He just stood there, not moving, his stare cold and unblinking. "Are you all right?" I asked again, my voice more urgent this time. My gut was telling me something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. And then, without warning, he stepped forward, closing the gap between us. I took another step back, my heart racing. "Hey, stop!" I shouted, but he didn't listen. His movements were slow, deliberate, like he was studying me. The air around us felt colder now, heavier. "Give me your keys," he said, his voice low and rough. It was like he wasn't even asking. It was a demand, and something in his tone made my skin crawl. I froze. My mind raced. This guy wasn't here for help. He wasn't lost. He was here to rob me. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. I reached into my pocket, feeling the cold metal of my keys. I hadn't thought about them until now, but the reality of the situation hit me like a punch in the gut. I had to act. He took another step forward, brandishing a knife. It wasn't big, but it didn't need to be. The glint of it in the dim light from my headlights was enough to make my stomach turn. I looked down at the car keys still in my hand. That's when a set of headlights appeared down the road and his focus shifted towards that. A car was coming. The man hesitated. His eyes flicked between me and the oncoming vehicle, and that's when I realized I had a chance. I didn't waste a second. I shoved past him, barely grazing his shoulder as I bolted back toward my car. The passing car was my moment of escape. I jumped into my Honda, slammed the door shut, and locked it, my hands shaking as I reached for the keys. He didn't follow. The car sped past, and I could hear the faint screech of tires on the icy road as the man stood motionless, staring at me from the darkness. I didn't waste another second. I started the engine, my hands barely steady enough to grip the wheel. I couldn't even remember pulling out of the ditch. I was too focused on just getting away. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest gas station, my heart still racing, my palms clammy. I dialed 911, but by the time the police arrived, the wrecked car was gone. They couldn't find the man either. They said they'd look into it, but honestly, I think they were just trying to reassure me. They told me there was nothing to worry about, but the whole thing felt off. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. Was the guy really in that car? Why was he acting like that? Was it just a coincidence that we both crashed at the same spot? Or was he waiting for anyone to pass by? I still think about it sometimes, especially when the nights are cold and the roads are icy. I don't take that back road anymore. It all started about a year ago when I moved into my new place here in Texas. I'd just gotten a job, and after a week of unpacking, I was exhausted and decided to treat myself to some pizza. I was living alone in a small one-story house on the edge of town, kind of isolated from the main area. The neighborhood seemed fine, nothing to worry about really. The houses were spaced out a bit, and there weren't many cars on the road after dark. It was peaceful. Maybe too peaceful. Anyway, that night I was sitting on the couch watching a random TV show. It was around 8 p.m., and I was looking forward to that pizza. I ordered it online, one of those delivery apps where you can track your food in real time. It said it would be here in about 30 minutes. I remember that it felt like forever, but that's probably because I was hungry. Finally, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting it to be that fast. I opened the door, and there he was, the delivery guy. He looked like your typical pizza driver, just a regular guy, maybe in his late 20s. He had a hat on with the pizza place's logo, a polo shirt, and jeans. He handed me the pizza with a smile. "Thanks," I said, about to shut the door when he hesitated. He looked me up and down, and I could tell he was uncomfortable. I figured maybe he thought I was going to tip him or something, but it wasn't that. He just stood there, kinda awkwardly, for a second. You're alone here?" he asked. It wasn't in a creepy way, not exactly. It just felt off, like he was fishing for something or making sure I was alone. "Yeah, I live here by myself," I said, starting to get a little weirded out. I mean, it wasn't like I was going to lie to him, but it wasn't something I usually tell strangers, especially not some random pizza guy at the door. He nodded, then seemed to hesitate even more, like he wanted to say something else. He looked over his shoulder toward the street, then back at me. It was strange, like he wasn't just waiting for me to close the door, but like he was looking for something. "Okay, have a good night," he said, almost too quickly, and then he turned around and walked away without looking back. I closed the door and went back to the couch, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I shrugged it off and figured I was just being paranoid. Maybe it was because I had been alone in the house all week and was just getting used to the quiet. But still, I kept thinking about that weird pause, the way he'd looked over his shoulder like he was waiting for someone. It was about an hour later when things really started to feel strange. I was halfway through my pizza, flipping through channels when I heard a soft knock at the door. At first, I thought it might have been my neighbor or something. Maybe they needed to borrow sugar or something, I don't know. But the knock came again, this time a little louder. I stood up from the couch and walked to the door. Through the peephole, I saw the same guy, the pizza delivery driver, standing there. But now he wasn't alone. There were two other men standing beside him. They looked just as normal as he did, maybe even less noticeable, wearing casual clothes. For a second, I just froze. I didn't know what to do. Why would they be back? Had I forgotten something with the order? Was it a mistake? I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't open the door right away, but I could hear them talking just outside. "Is she home?" one of them asked in a low voice. It sounded like they were whispering to each other, but I could make out the words. "I think so. I saw her through the window," the delivery guy answered. "All right, you sure she's alone?" The other guy spoke now. "Yeah, just make sure you knock twice, like last time. Let's get in and out, quick." My heart started racing. I felt an immediate rush of panic, but I couldn't move. My hands were shaking, and I tried to remember what I was supposed to do in situations like this. Was this some sort of robbery? Why would they come back? And why did they think I was alone? I quickly ran to my phone and dialed 911. My voice was shaky when I answered the dispatcher's questions, but I managed to explain that I had a feeling I was about to be robbed, and that there were people at my door trying to break in. The operator told me to stay calm and lock all doors and windows, so I did that as fast as I could. I could hear their voices getting louder, still talking to each other outside. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to stay as quiet as possible. For what felt like forever, I waited, not daring to move or make a sound. Then I heard them, the door handle rattling. It wasn't hard, but enough that I knew they were trying to open it. They weren't just waiting for me to open the door like a normal delivery guy. This was different. They were trying to force their way in. And just then, I heard sirens in the distance. The sound of the police getting closer was like a breath of fresh air. The guys outside must have heard them too, because they froze for a second, then started to whisper more urgently. "Come on, we've got to go," one of them said. But it was too late. The doorbell rang, and before they could make a move, the police were there. They arrested all three of them right there on my porch. I don't think they expected the cops to show up so quickly, but I guess I was lucky I called when I did. Turns out the delivery guy was the one who had been planning the whole thing. He had been in and out of a few places, casing the houses in the neighborhood, looking for easy targets. And the other two? One was a guy he'd worked with before, and the other was someone he had recruited for this particular job. They were all in on it. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't called the cops when I did, or if they'd gotten inside. I've thought about that a lot since then. Would they have robbed me? Would they have hurt me? I don't know. All I know is that the whole thing could have ended much worse. It took a while to feel safe in my house again, even though the police said everything was fine. I still get uneasy when the doorbell rings, especially at night. That delivery driver never came back to work, but I still think about what might have happened if I had been less cautious. I guess sometimes it's better to trust your gut, even when it seems like nothing is wrong. It all started after I left the gym one evening. I'd been at the gym for about an hour or so, getting in a good workout, and I had a pretty decent sweat going. I was feeling good, like I'd hit my goals for the day. The sun had just set, and while the streets weren't exactly empty, it was getting quieter. A lot of people had already gone inside as the storm started rolling in. I live in Texas, so by this time, the heat of the day had started to cool down, but the humidity was still a nightmare. I was looking forward to getting home, taking a shower, and just chilling for the night. As I was walking out of the gym, I noticed the sky had gotten darker faster than I expected. The weather here can change quick, especially in the summer, and within minutes I saw lightning off in the distance. And then it started. The rain came down in sheets, like someone flipped a switch. It was one of those storms where the sky goes pitch black, and it feels like the whole world's about to flood. My apartment wasn't far from the gym, just a few blocks away, but the rain was coming down so hard, I knew I'd get drenched before I even made it home. So I figured I'd take a shortcut through the alley. There's this alleyway that cuts between two buildings on the way home. It's not the best lit place, but it's quick and gets you out of the storm faster. I've walked through there dozens of times. It's not the kind of alley where you expect something crazy to happen, you know? Just a place to duck out of the rain for a minute. But this time, as soon as I stepped into the alley, something didn't feel right. I didn't know exactly what it was. Maybe it was the way the storm made everything sound distant, or the fact that the lights overhead flickered and buzzed. But there was this weird tension in the air. Still, I kept walking. The rain was pouring so hard now that the alley was starting to flood at the edges, and the wind was howling like crazy. I pulled my hoodie up over my head and kept moving as fast as I could. Halfway through the alley, I heard something. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the sound of the rain hitting the pavement. But then I realized there was a rhythm to it, steady and deliberate. Someone was walking behind me. The alley's pretty narrow, and there wasn't anywhere to hide or step aside. I kept walking, trying not to think too much about it. Maybe it was just someone else trying to get out of the storm. But then the footsteps grew louder. They weren't just behind me. They were getting closer. At that point, I started to feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I quickened my pace, but so did the footsteps. I glanced over my shoulder and saw a shadow in the rain. I couldn't make out any details because it was so dark, but there was definitely someone back there. The figure was moving fast. I started to walk even faster, but my heart was pounding. I didn't want to look like I was panicking, but every part of me was screaming to get out of there. The footsteps didn't stop, though. They were still right behind me. I could feel them getting closer with every step. By this point, I was almost to the end of the alley where the streetlights started to light up a little more. I figured I'd get there and be safe, but the fear was making me do stupid things. I could hear the person's breathing now, heavy and labored. It didn't make sense with the storm raging around us, like his breath was louder than the rain. It was unsettling. I don't know why I did it, but I turned around to face him. I think I was hoping maybe I'd just spook him off, make him think I wasn't scared or something. But what I saw made my blood run cold. There was a guy, maybe in his late 20s or early 30s, standing about 5 feet away from me. He was drenched from head to toe, just like I was, but the way he was staring at me, I couldn't look away. His grin wasn't just unsettling, it was predatory. And before I could react, he moved so fast, closing the distance between us in a split second. He lunged. I didn't think. I just reacted. I ducked to the side and shoved my shoulder into his chest, knocking him off balance. For a moment, I was off my feet, stumbling forward, but adrenaline kicked in. I didn't think, didn't stop. I turned and bolted out of the alley as fast as I could, not even caring about the rain hitting my face. I was just focused on getting out of there. I heard him cursing behind me, but I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if he was coming after me again. I just kept running, my legs burning, the rain blurring everything around me. When I reached the end of the alley and ran out into the street, I finally stopped gasping for air. My whole body was shaking and my mind was racing, trying to piece together what just happened. I didn't stop running until I was safely inside my building, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept imagining that guy's eyes, that sick grin, and I just couldn't shake the feeling that something worse had been about to happen. The next day, I found out from a neighbor that a guy had been arrested in the area for attacking someone a few weeks earlier. Apparently, he had been stalking people around that part of town, following them through alleys and back streets. The police said he had tried to grab a woman not far from where I had been, but luckily, she managed to get away. When I heard that, it hit me. That guy I had seen last night, he was the same guy. I don't know what he was planning on doing, but I'm just thankful I got out of there. Now, I never take shortcuts, and every time I walk near that alley, I can't help but remember how close I came to something much worse happening. So yeah, I'm telling you this because you never know who's lurking around. Stay aware of your surroundings and don't trust that empty alley or shortcut, no matter how familiar it seems. It all started with a plan. My buddies and I, Tom, Jake, and Matt, decided we needed a weekend to just get away from everything. We were all worn out from work, stress, and just life in general. So we found this remote campsite in the Davis Mountains of Texas. I mean, it looked perfect on the map. Secluded, no crowds, just nature and peace. We'd been to campsites before, but nothing like this. This was supposed to be a break from the usual. We could hike, tell stories, maybe crack open some beers. Simple, quiet, perfect. We arrived on Friday afternoon. The sun was still high, and the air had that dry, warm Texan heat that clung to you no matter how many times you wiped your forehead. But the drive up to the campsite had already been beautiful. The whole area was isolated, surrounded by dense trees, the occasional cliff, and the smell of the earth. We set up our tents and built a fire. Everything was peaceful, just like we'd imagined. That first night was fine. We were all sitting around the fire, talking about random stuff, joking, playing cards, and enjoying the dark sky that felt like it was stretching on forever. The fire crackled, the crickets chirped, and the only other noise was the wind rustling through the trees. But I noticed something. There were no other campers nearby. The site we'd chosen was isolated, sure, but there were usually a few more people, even in remote places like this. It felt odd, but I figured we were just lucky. Around midnight, we all turned in. Matt and Jake shared a tent, and Tom and I were in another one. I didn't think too much of it when I heard faint footsteps outside our tent, but it was probably just some wildlife. Deer, maybe, or a raccoon. We didn't have a bear problem here, as far as I knew. The night passed quietly, except for the occasional rustling. I tried not to think much of it, especially since we were so far out. It felt safe. Until the second night. The second day was exhausting. We hiked for hours, lost track of time, and didn't get back to camp until late afternoon. The heat had burned off, but the air was still warm and dry. By the time the sun started setting, we were all ready to eat and get comfortable by the fire. That night, things started getting weird. We were about halfway through dinner when Tom suddenly stood up from the fire and looked down at the ground, his face going pale. "What the hell?" he muttered. We all stopped what we were doing and turned to look at him. "What's wrong?" I asked. Tom didn't answer right away. He just stared at the ground, his hand hovering over one of our car tires. When I looked closer, I saw it too. The tire was slashed like someone had used a knife to cut through the rubber. "Are you serious?" Matt said, sounding confused. "Who the hell would do that?" We all walked over to inspect it. The other 3 tires were fine, but one was completely flat. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't just pop it. They destroyed it. "Must have happened while we were out hiking," Jake said, his voice tight. "But how did they get this close to the car without us hearing them?" We started looking around the campsite, more alert now, but there was no sign of anyone. No movement in the trees, nothing out of place except the tire. "This is bad," Tom said, his voice dropping. "We're stuck here." We had no spare tire, and we were a good few hours from the nearest town. We tried to stay calm. We figured we could just call for help in the morning. The ranger station wasn't far, and someone would come by sooner or later. But as night fell, the real terror didn't hit until later. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something scratching at our tent. At first, I thought I was imagining it, maybe a branch brushing against the fabric. But then the sound came again. It was more deliberate this time, a soft scrape like something was dragging across the tent. My heart started racing. I held my breath, not sure what to do. I waited, listening, trying to make out the sound. And that's when I heard something else, a voice. A low whisper. "Are you in there?" I froze. I couldn't breathe. Tom was still asleep beside me, but I could see he was twitching in his sleep, probably hearing the same thing. "Who's there?" I whispered. No answer. I slowly unzipped a little opening in the tent to peek outside. My heart dropped when I saw him. There was a man standing about 15 feet away, just past the fire's light. He was tall, thin, and wearing a hooded jacket, even though it wasn't that cold. He was standing perfectly still, staring at our tent. I held my breath, watching. The moment I saw him, he turned and started walking toward the trees, disappearing into the dark. I didn't know what to do. Should I wake the others? Should we just stay quiet and hope he left? I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. I shook Tom awake. Tom, wake up," I whispered urgently. He groggily opened his eyes, and I could see he was still half in a daze. "What's going on?" he mumbled. "I saw someone," I whispered. "There's someone out there." Tom's face turned pale. He grabbed his flashlight, and we both carefully stepped out of the tent. Jake and Matt were already up, their eyes wide with fear, and we huddled together by the fire, trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when we heard the footsteps again, much closer this time. Someone was out there. They were watching us. We huddled by the fire, trying to stay close to the car, when the sound of branches snapping in the distance sent a shiver down my spine. The man, or whoever it was getting closer. I was so sure he was out there, stalking us, waiting for the right moment. The air felt thicker, heavier. We all kept glancing over our shoulders, half expecting to see him behind us. Then came a sharp snap of a branch. The sound was sudden, unnervingly close. My heart stopped. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. And then, without warning, there was another rustling from behind the trees, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving toward us. It was coming fast. We all stood, frozen in fear, when out of the darkness, the figure of the man emerged again, but this time, he wasn't alone. He had something in his hand. I could barely make it out at first, but then I saw it clearly. He was holding a big hunting knife. I don't know what was going through my head in that moment. All I knew was that we were in serious trouble. "Get to the car!" I shouted, without thinking. We all sprinted toward the vehicle, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I glanced back and saw the man was charging toward us, moving faster than I thought possible. He was yelling something I couldn't make out, but the fear in his voice was unmistakable. We reached the car, but the slashed tire stopped us cold. There was no way we could drive away without a spare, and we didn't have time to fix it. In that moment of panic, I grabbed a tire iron from the back of the car. It was all I could think of to defend ourselves. But then Matt, bless him, had an idea. "I'm calling the ranger station," he said, already pulling out his phone. He dialed the number, his voice trembling as he explained the situation. We didn't know if the Rangers could get here in time, but at that point, we had no choice. For a second, I thought maybe it was too late. But then I looked back at the man, and I noticed something. His attention had shifted. He wasn't charging at us anymore. He stood there for a long moment, just watching. I couldn't make out his expression in the darkness, but it felt like he was waiting. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the trees. Matt, still on the phone with the ranger, urged us to get in the car. The ranger said they were coming, but it might take a while. We all piled into the car, the air thick with tension. We sat in the car, hearts racing, not knowing what to expect. Hours passed. Every snap of a twig, every rustling in the trees made us jump. The darkness felt thicker than ever. I kept staring into the trees, half expecting him to emerge, but he never did. He had just vanished. Around 4 a.m., we heard the sound of tires crunching over gravel. The rangers had finally arrived. We were never so relieved to see headlights in the distance. They pulled up beside our car, and we quickly got out to talk to them. The rangers were calm but serious, advising us to stay close while they went out on foot. They had a team, and they would track the man from a distance. We showed them where we'd last seen him, the direction he'd gone. They nodded and immediately set out to search the area. We didn't leave the car. We couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere, watching us. After what felt like an eternity, the rangers finally returned. They had tracked him down, hidden just a few miles from where we'd seen him disappear. Armed. The rangers had managed to corner him, and they arrested him without a struggle. We learned later that he had been out there for days, using the isolation to his advantage. He was a dangerous man, watching for anyone who wandered too far from civilization. We never knew his exact plan, but we sure as hell were glad the rangers showed up when they did. I've always been the kind of person who craves solitude. The noise, the crowds, the chaos of everyday life, it all gets to me after a while. That's why I decided to spend a few days hiking in Big Bend National Park, a remote stretch of wilderness in the farthest reaches of Texas. It was winter, and most people stayed away, which suited me just fine. I needed to clear my head, get away from everything, and lose myself in the stillness of the desert. My name's Alex. I'm in my late 20s, an outdoorsy guy, nothing too special. I've hiked all over the country before, Alaska, Colorado, Wyoming, but this trip felt different. Big Bend had always intrigued me, and with a few days off work and no one to answer to, I figured now was the time to explore it. It was around noon when I began the hike, the sky clear and crisp with a light layer of snow on the ground. The trail I picked was a lesser-known route, winding through sparse desert scrub and distant mesas, far away from the usual tourist paths. The air was cold but refreshing, and I was more than comfortable as I set off. The snow crunched beneath my boots, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees and the distant calls of birds. At first, the peace was soothing. There's something calming about being alone in a place like that. The vast emptiness making you feel both insignificant and free. I hadn't expected to see anyone. The park's backcountry trails don't exactly attract crowds in the winter. I was prepared for the isolation. But about an hour into the hike, I started to notice something strange. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. It was that feeling you get when you think someone might be watching you, but you're not sure. I'd glance over my shoulder every now and then, but each time there was nothing, just snow, trees, and the silence of the wilderness. I shrugged it off, thinking I was just being paranoid. After all, I was in the middle of nowhere, with no reason to suspect anyone would be out here. But then I began seeing it. A shadow, or maybe it was a shape. Something that darted behind the trees just at the edge of my vision. Each time I stopped, whether to drink water, stretch my legs, or adjust my pack, I'd feel it again, that unsettling sensation that someone or something was nearby. The feeling grew stronger with each passing minute. At first, I chalked it up to my imagination. Maybe it was an animal, a deer, or a coyote. But as I continued, I began to notice more, fleeting glimpses of movement just beyond my line of sight, shadows that didn't belong. I'd turned my head, but nothing was there. Still, the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. Then I saw him. I was rounding a bend in the trail when I spotted him, a man standing about 30 feet off the path. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket that blended into the trees, and he was just standing there, not moving, not doing anything, just watching me. My heart skipped a beat. I froze. My first instinct was to call out, maybe ask if he was lost, but the words stuck in my throat. Something about the way he stood there, so still, so out of place, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. No one stands like that in the wilderness. He wasn't a hiker. He didn't have a pack or gear. Just a silhouette against the trees, staring in my direction. I don't know how long I stood there, but the moment felt like an eternity. I didn't know what to do. Finally, I decided not to engage. Maybe he was just someone passing through, or maybe I was just overthinking things. I turned my head and kept walking, my pace quickening as I tried to shake the feeling of unease. But every time I glanced over my shoulder, he was still there, watching, not moving, just standing, as though he had always been a part of the landscape, blending into the shadows, waiting for me to notice him. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. There was a presence, something cold and calculated, keeping pace with me from a distance. I tried to push myself faster, willing my mind to stay focused, but I couldn't escape that feeling. I'd stop to rest, and when I did, I'd glance over my shoulder, only to find him further down the trail, his figure hidden behind a rock or a tree, always just out of clear view, but always there, lurking just beyond the trees. I don't know why I didn't leave sooner. Maybe I thought it was just coincidence. Maybe I was trying to rationalize it, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. And then it happened again. I was coming up to a clearing when I saw him once more. This time, he wasn't hidden behind trees or rocks. He was standing by a large boulder, partially visible but still keeping his distance. He was watching me, his figure clear against the bright snow, and this time I couldn't deny it. He wasn't a hiker. There was something in the way he moved, or didn't move, that sent a chill down my spine. He wasn't trying to hide. He was standing there, waiting. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt like lead. My pulse was pounding in my ears. The terror wasn't immediate. It crept up slowly, like a shadow at the edge of your vision. But now I felt it full force. He was following me. I didn't run. I should have, but I didn't. I kept walking, a little faster now, trying to act normal, to pretend that everything was fine. But every time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw him again, just enough to make out his dark clothes blending into the background, just enough to know he was there. I remember stopping one last time, this time to check the time on my phone. I heard a sound behind me, something soft but distinct, a crunch in the snow. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was nothing. The trail was empty. Then I saw it. His face, his eyes. They were visible now, barely peering from behind a tree, staring straight at me. The fear that washed over me in that instant was unlike anything I had ever felt. His eyes were cold, empty, like he wasn't even human. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My legs moved before my brain had a chance to process. I turned and ran. The panic surged through me, and I pushed myself harder, my heart racing, my breath ragged in the cold air. I couldn't hear anything but the pounding of my own footsteps, but I knew he was behind me. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, faster, faster, until I finally saw it, the ranger station in the distance. I burst through the door, gasping for air, and barely managed to explain what had happened. The rangers were quick to respond. They sent out a team to check the trail, but when they returned, they didn't have any answers. They didn't find him. There were no tracks in the snow, no signs of anyone. But they did find something else. An abandoned campsite a few miles back has the fire long cold and some scattered gear. To this day, I don't know who he was or what he wanted. The Rangers never found any trace of him, and there were no reports of missing persons in the area. But every time I think back to that day, the memory of those cold, empty eyes still sends a shiver down my spine. So, if you're ever out there, hiking alone in Big Bend, especially in the winter when the trails are deserted, keep an eye out. If you see someone standing too still, just watching you from the trees, don't wait around to find out who they are. Don't wait for them to get closer. Just run. I never thought anything weird would happen when I moved into this house. I mean, it's just a house, right? Uh, it's in a quiet neighborhood in Texas, just outside the city. The kind of place where everyone keeps to themselves and you don't really have to worry about anything. The house itself was perfect for me, just big enough for one person, with a huge backyard and these amazing large windows that let in tons of natural light. I loved them right away. The first time I looked at the windows, I thought about how nice it would be to sit by them with a cup of coffee and watch the world go by. The house sat on a good-sized lot, so you couldn't see much of your neighbors unless you looked out the back, and even then, the fences were pretty tall. It felt like I had my own little slice of privacy, you know? At first, everything was perfect. I unpacked my stuff, arranged my furniture, and settled into the quiet routine of living alone. But after a couple of weeks, I started to notice something strange. Every morning, after the sun had come up, I'd walk into the living room, and there would be these marks on the windows. Smudges. They weren't there the night before, but they always appeared when the sun hit the glass. It started small, just a few faint smudges on the lower corners of the windows. At first, I figured it was just dust or maybe a stray fingerprint. But then they started to get bigger, almost like someone was pressing their face against the glass, leaving behind this odd imprint of skin and nose. I figured it was just dirt from the outside. Maybe some kids playing in the yard or a stray animal brushing against the windows, but every time I wiped it off, it would come back the next day. I tried not to let it get to me. Maybe it was just a part of living in a new place, things I hadn't noticed before. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, pressing up against my windows, just watching me. One night, about a month after I'd moved in, I was sitting in the living room watching TV. The house was quiet as usual, and I was getting ready to head to bed when I glanced over at the window. That's when I saw it. There was something there. A shape. A dark silhouette pressed right up against the glass. It was just a shadow at first, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized it wasn't a shadow at all. It was the shape of a person. Someone was standing outside, right up against the window, so close that I could see the outline of their body pressed against the glass. I froze. My heart started pounding in my chest. I couldn't see their face, but I could tell they were watching me. It wasn't like a casual glance from a neighbor. This was different. It felt intense, like they were waiting for something. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Should I open the door and confront them? I didn't move, just stared at the figure for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few seconds. Then the figure slowly stepped back from the window, disappearing into the shadows. I didn't hear anything else after that. No footsteps, no car starting, just the quiet of the night. I was too scared to go outside and check. I locked the door and closed the blinds, but that night I didn't sleep at all. The image of that person's shadow, standing there just watching, kept replaying in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next day, I checked the window where I'd seen the figure. Sure enough, there were fresh smudges on the glass, but this time, they were more distinct. A perfect outline of a face, like someone had pressed their nose right up against the glass. I shuddered and quickly wiped it off, telling myself I was just imagining things, but the smudges kept coming back. Every morning, after the sun rose, there they were again. It was always the same. Marks on the lower half of the window where someone's face had been pressed against the glass. I started getting paranoid. I began to check the windows more often, looking for signs that someone was outside. I'd peek through the blinds, but I never saw anyone. I started locking the windows at night, even though I never really felt the need to before. It was like I could sense someone out there, watching, waiting. Then, one night, it happened again. I was sitting in the living room, minding my own business, when I saw the figure outside the window once more. This time, it was darker, and the shape was clearer. It was a man. I was sure of it. He was standing just outside the window, staring in. His face was close to the glass, so close I could see the faint outline of his features. It wasn't a trick of the light or my imagination. It was a real person. And this time, he didn't move away. I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to call the police, but I was too scared to make a sound. I didn't want him to know I saw him. What if he was armed? What if he was dangerous? For a moment, I just stared at him, paralyzed with fear. His eyes were locked on mine. It felt like he could see right through me. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a knife. My heart stopped. He was holding it in his hand, turning it slowly as if he was examining it. I don't know how long I stood there, but it felt like hours. The man didn't move. He just kept staring at me, holding that knife. I don't know what came over me, but I suddenly knew I had to act. I grabbed my phone and called 911, my hands shaking so much I could barely hold the phone. I didn't know if the man could hear me, but I whispered into the phone, telling the operator what was happening. The police arrived minutes later, and by the time they got there, the man was still standing outside, staring at the window. But when the officers approached, he turned and bolted. I heard the sound of footsteps running away from the house. The police chased him down, and it didn't take long to catch him. He was arrested without incident, but what they found on him was even more disturbing. They searched his phone and discovered photos of me, taken through the windows when I didn't even know he was there. Hundreds of pictures, all from different angles, taken at different times. It made my stomach churn just thinking about it. The man was charged with stalking and attempted burglary, but I'm still not sure what he was planning. Was he trying to break into my house, or was he just watching me? Either way, it was terrifying. The whole situation left me feeling paranoid and unsafe in my own home. I haven't been able to look out my windows the same way since then. Every time I walk by them, I wonder if someone's out there watching me again. It's not something you can just forget. I live in a small house on the outskirts of a town in Texas. It's pretty rural, and my neighbors are few and far between. It was a Thursday night in late October when it happened, right in the middle of one of those terrible thunderstorms we get down here. It had been raining all day, but around 8 p.m. the storm really picked up. The wind was howling and the rain was coming down in sheets. It was one of those storms where you could hear the trees creaking and groaning outside like they might snap any second. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then the lights flickered and went out. It wasn't unusual for power to go out during storms like this, so I wasn't too concerned at first, but obviously it's always a bit unnerving when it happens, especially when you live alone. I figured I'd just ride it out. I grabbed some candles from the kitchen drawer and set them up in the living room. There's something kind of peaceful about the soft light of candles, you know? Almost comforting when everything else feels so chaotic. So I sat on my couch, listening to the storm and just letting the quiet settle around me. I wasn't even watching TV or anything, just scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself. About an hour or so passed, and the storm was getting worse. The wind was so strong I could hear it slapping against the side of the house. I could see the tree branches swaying wildly outside through the windows. Then I heard something. It was faint at first, but I heard the distinct sound of footsteps on the gravel outside. Crunch! Crunch! Shh! It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the rain. It was deliberate, like someone was walking up my driveway. My heart started pounding. There's no way anyone would be out there in this weather. The thought made me freeze. I got up slowly and walked to the window, trying to peek through the curtains without making much noise. I didn't see anything at first, but my mind started racing. Maybe it was just an animal, I thought. Maybe it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again. More steps. Now, I know for a fact there wasn't anyone living close by. My closest neighbor is a good mile away. So who would be out there in the pouring rain at this time of night? I backed away from the window and grabbed my phone. I didn't know who to call. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but I felt like something wasn't right. I checked the time. It was almost 10 p.m. The footsteps stopped for a second, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that it was just some random person walking by or maybe someone who was lost, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to make sure all the doors and windows were locked. I walked through the house quietly, double-checking everything. I even went into the back bedroom to make sure the window was secured. When I went back to the front of the house, I felt this cold, nagging sense of being watched. It's hard to explain, like someone's eyes were on me, even though I was alone. I took a deep breath and told myself to calm down. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The curtains at the front window were slightly parted. They weren't fully closed like I thought I'd left them. I hadn't touched them since I last checked. The wind was really picking up now, and I couldn't imagine how they'd moved on their own, especially since there was no breeze inside the house. I couldn't help myself. I slowly, cautiously pulled the curtains back, just enough to look outside. That's when I saw him. A man, standing right outside my window facing me. At first I thought maybe it was just some stranger seeking shelter from the storm. But as my eyes focused, I realized something even worse. He was staring at me. I couldn't see his face clearly. He was drenched from head to toe, water dripping from his clothes and hair, but I could tell he wasn't looking at anything else. He was locked on me. My stomach dropped, my heart was pounding in my ears, and I froze. My first instinct was to scream, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed with fear. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring back at him. It felt like an eternity. The rain was beating so hard against the window that it almost drowned out the sound of my own breathing. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there watching. And I swear to God, I could feel the weight of his gaze even though there was glass between us. I stepped back from the window, feeling like I was about to pass out from the tension. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the cops? Should I confront him? But something told me it wasn't safe. I grabbed my phone again, and this time I called my neighbor. The phone rang a few times before voicemail picked up, and I left a shaky message, not knowing what else to say. Hey, I think someone's outside my house. Can you call me back? Please. I'm freaking out. I was about to call the cops when the footsteps returned. This time they were louder, closer, heading toward the front porch. I knew this wasn't my imagination anymore. Someone was here, right outside. I pressed myself up against the wall, heart hammering, and waited. Seconds felt like hours. I heard the door handle jiggle a little, but it didn't open. I wasn't sure if it was him trying to get in or if it was just the wind messing with me. Then, all of a sudden, it stopped. The footsteps, the movement, everything. Complete silence. I waited a full 5 minutes before I dared peek out again. This time, the man wasn't at the window anymore. He wasn't anywhere in sight. That night I locked every window and door, even the ones I never used. I didn't sleep at all. I never saw him again. But I don't think I'll ever forget that moment. Seeing him standing there in the rain, staring at me, waiting for me to do something. I don't know what he wanted. I don't know if he was just watching or if he had something worse planned. It was one of those rare weekends where Sarah and I both had a break from work, and we decided to head out for a camping trip. We'd been talking about it for months, ever since we saw photos of the Guadalupe Mountains National Park. The towering peaks, the open skies, the isolation, it sounded like the perfect place to escape the endless noise of city life. The idea of unplugging for a few days, just the two of us in the wild, was exciting. We weren't experts, but we had enough camping experience to handle a weekend trip. The plan was simple: hike during the day, set up camp at night, and spend the evenings under the stars. Nothing too crazy. Just some fresh air, some quiet, and maybe a campfire or two. We arrived at the park on Friday afternoon, the golden light of late afternoon bathing the mountains in a warm glow. The parking lot near the trailhead was nearly empty, just a few cars scattered around and the occasional rustling of the wind through the dry brush. It was the kind of place where you could hear every single sound, nothing to drown it out except the open sky and the vast, empty wilderness. I could feel the weight of the city life lifting as we unloaded our gear. There was something so peaceful about being out there, surrounded by nothing but towering cliffs and deep canyons. As we set up the tent, we couldn't help but admire the sunset, the colors of the sky shifting from soft oranges and purples to a deep, dusky blue. It felt like time was slowing down. We spent the next few hours hiking around, exploring the trailhead, and taking photos of the rugged landscape. The air was dry but crisp, sharply different from the humidity we were used to. Even though it was still early in the evening, the sun was already slipping behind the peaks, and the temperature was dropping quickly. By the time we made it back to camp, we had a fire going and a simple dinner ready. We sat on the rocks near the fire, eating and laughing as the darkness crept in, the stars starting to twinkle above us. It wasn't until around 10 p.m. that things started to feel off. I'd just dozed off in the tent when I felt Sarah's hand on my arm. At first, I thought she was just adjusting in her sleep, but then she gave me a little shake. "Hey," she whispered, her voice tight and strained. "Do you hear that?" I blinked, confused. The night was quiet, too quiet in fact. All I could hear was the sound of the fire crackling and the wind picking up in the trees outside. I listened harder, straining to hear anything over the usual nighttime noises. That's when I heard it. It wasn't the wind or an animal or anything natural. It was the unmistakable sound of a child crying, soft, muffled, distant, but unmistakably human. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't frantic or terrified. It was more like a quiet, sorrowful wail, almost like a child lost and calling for someone. I froze. My heart rate shot up as I processed what I was hearing. Sarah's grip tightened on my arm. I could feel her body tense beside me as she listened, wide-eyed, to the sound. The wails were faint but consistent, echoing in the still night air. It wasn't just the noise itself, it was the way it carried through the air, like it was traveling from some deep, unreachable part of the mountains. I opened the tent flaps slightly, scanning the darkness outside. There were no lights in sight, no other campers, no signs of life. The park was remote, miles away from any other trails or campsites. The nearest campground was a good few miles away, and I hadn't seen a single family on the trail earlier. "Maybe it's an animal," I said, though even I knew it was a weak suggestion. Nothing about this sound seemed like any animal I'd ever heard. Sarah's voice was trembling. "Should we check it out?" I hesitated. A part of me wanted to figure out what was going on, but something in my gut told me it wasn't a good idea. The sound itself had a quality to it that didn't sit right. It didn't sound like a lost child or a family in trouble. It felt almost purposeful. But Sarah wasn't backing down. "What if someone needs help?" I sighed, trying to shake the uneasy feeling off. "All right, let's go take a look." We grabbed our flashlights and carefully stepped out of the tent. The night was cold, and the air felt thick with silence. The sky was clear, but the darkness of the forest swallowed up the little light from the stars. We tried to stay quiet, our boots crunching on the dry ground louder than we'd have liked. The sound of the crying hadn't stopped, but it seemed a little farther away now, deeper into the woods. The farther we walked, the more uncomfortable I became. The crying seemed to stay in one place, like it was stuck in the air, drifting and echoing through the trees. It didn't get closer, didn't seem to move, just hung there, like it was pulling us forward, deeper and deeper into the night. We walked for about 10 minutes, the flashlight beams sweeping over the terrain, the trees gnarled and twisted by the desert wind. The path seemed to narrow as we continued, and soon we came upon a small clearing. The crying was louder here, but still there was nothing to see. Just some scrubby grass, scattered rocks, and a few old juniper trees bending in the wind. Then Sarah pointed toward a tree at the edge of the clearing, her voice barely a whisper. "Look." I followed her gaze, my stomach dropping when I saw what she was pointing at. Hanging from a low branch of a twisted, gnarled tree was an old baby doll. It swung gently in the breeze, its body swaying with an unnatural rhythm. The doll was weathered, dirty, its face cracked and worn from exposure to the elements. One of its eyes had been torn out, leaving a hollow socket, and its mouth was frozen in a permanent, twisted grimace. Its limbs were bent awkwardly, almost as if they had been purposely twisted into grotesque, unnatural positions. The whole thing was like a sickening mockery of something innocent. And there it was, just hanging there in the wind, waiting. The crying stopped immediately. I don't know how long we stood there, just staring at the doll. It was as if the world had gone silent around us. My brain tried to make sense of it, tried to piece together what we were seeing, but nothing felt right. It didn't belong there. There was no reason for it to be there. And yet, there it was, swinging in the darkness. I could feel Sarah's breath on my neck, hot and shaky as she whispered in my ear, "We need to go, now." Just as I turned to respond, there was a rustling behind us. I whipped around, flashlight flashing through the dark, but there was nothing. The air was still. The woods were silent. It was like the sound had vanished into thin air, leaving nothing but the hollow, oppressive quiet. I couldn't breathe. We didn't speak. We didn't even look at each other. We just turned and ran. The crunch of our boots on the gravel and dirt was deafening in the stillness, and every shadow felt like it was moving. The trail back to camp seemed to stretch on forever, each step feeling heavier than the last. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was watching us from the darkness. When we finally reached the tent, we didn't waste a second. I slammed the flap shut and locked the zipper with trembling hands. We both just sat there in the dark, staring at the fabric of the tent, unable to sleep. The next morning, everything felt different. We packed up in a rush, the weight of the night hanging over us like a dark cloud. We headed straight to the park office to speak with a ranger, desperate for some kind of explanation. When we told him what had happened, his expression changed instantly. His eyes darkened and his voice lowered. "That's not the first time people have heard it," he said, his tone serious. "That crying sound and that doll, it's been reported before. The doll's a lure set up by criminals to rob hikers. They use it to draw people off the main trail. It's meant to make you think someone's in trouble, so you go off the path. They wait until you're far enough away, and then they ambush you." I felt my stomach churn. I didn't want to believe it, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. The cry. The doll. The sudden silence when we found it. It wasn't just a freak occurrence. We had narrowly avoided something far worse than we realized. The ranger told us not to trust any strange noises or emergencies, particularly when they didn't make sense. We left that afternoon. I don't know if it was the isolation of the park or just the unnerving image of that twisted doll, but something inside me told me I'd never go camping there again. As I think back on that night, I can't help but feel a lingering sense of dread. Maybe we were lucky. Maybe we barely escaped something much darker. All I know is, every time I close my eyes, I can still hear that eerie wail echoing through the dark and the ghostly image of that doll swinging in the wind. I'd always thought of myself as pretty tough, especially when it came to things like being home alone or babysitting. Sure, I'd get startled by jump scares in movies, but real life? Nah. I never thought I'd be the type to get spooked. That was until one winter night in 2020, when I was 19 years old, babysitting for a friend in a small town near the edge of West Texas. It was a Friday evening when Rachel asked me to watch her kids while she and her boyfriend went out for a night. We'd been friends since high school, so it was a pretty routine gig. Nothing fancy. Just a few hours to watch her two kids, Zoe, a 6-year-old, and Liam, a 9-year-old, while they were off to have some time to themselves. I'd babysat for her countless times, so I knew the drill. The house was out on the outskirts of town, past the last few houses on the road, near a wide open field with no other homes for a good mile. I remember thinking how remote it felt, but I shrugged it off. This was Texas, after all. Small towns, quiet roads, nothing too out of the ordinary. I arrived at their house just as the sun was setting. The air was cool, but not unbearable, typical for a Texas winter. I walked in, settled the kids in front of the TV, and grabbed some snacks. Everything was calm at first. The kids were watching their favorite movie, and I was scrolling through my phone in the kitchen, minding my own business. Rachel had warned me that they'd probably be asleep by 9, and by 9:30, the house was quiet. The only sounds left were the soft hum of the heater and the occasional rustle of the kids shifting on the couch. That's when I first noticed him. I was sitting at the kitchen table, mindlessly scrolling through Instagram, when I saw a shadow dart past the window. It was barely noticeable at first, just a flicker of movement. But when I looked up, I saw it again, this time more clearly. A tall, dark figure moving across the yard right at the edge of the light from the street lamp at the end of the driveway. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a stray dog. Out here, things could get weird with wildlife roaming around, but then I saw the figure again. It was walking slowly, almost pacing back and forth. It didn't seem like it was just passing by. It was moving with purpose, back and forth across the yard between the trees near the fence. My heart started beating a little faster. It was unusual, sure, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just a neighbor or someone walking down the road. Still, the more I watched, the more unsettled I felt. Why was he just walking in circles like that? No one I knew would be out here at this hour. There were no other houses for miles. I tried to focus on the kids, but I kept glancing at the window. The figure was still out there, moving around, always just out of full view. It didn't seem to go anywhere, just circling the yard. A chill ran down my spine. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stood up from the kitchen table and moved into the living room, hoping a change of scenery would distract me. But as I walked past the window, I froze. The man, or whatever he was standing still now, right outside the window, his back turned toward me. My heart dropped into my stomach. I couldn't see his face, but I could tell he was tall, probably in his mid-30s, wearing a dark jacket and standing completely still. It was like he knew I was watching him. My stomach twisted into a knot. I backed away from the window slowly, trying not to make any noise. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. There was no way anyone would be out there at this time of night unless something was wrong. I grabbed my phone and tried to text Rachel, but when I checked my bars, I realized there was no signal. I tried calling her, but the call wouldn't go through. My stomach dropped further. The house had spotty reception, sure, but I usually had enough to send a message or make a quick call. I tried again, but nothing. I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was just some stranger passing through the area, but the feeling of dread was suffocating. I needed to check the doors. I moved into the hallway and slowly checked the locks. Everything was secure. As I walked back toward the kitchen, I peeked out the window once more. That's when it hit me. The figure was no longer standing still. Now he was closer. I could see his outline more clearly now, and I realized that he was standing right next to the window, too close. His back was facing the glass, but I could tell by the way he was standing that he was aware of me. I froze. My body went rigid with terror, and I found it hard to breathe. I wanted to scream for Rachel, but I couldn't. The kids were asleep, and I didn't want to risk waking them. I felt trapped. The only thing I could do was wait. I took a step back, still watching the window, and that's when it happened. There was a tap. At first, I thought I imagined it, but then it came again. Tap, 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 slow and deliberate. The man was tapping on the window. I froze, my heart racing in my chest. I felt my breath catch in my throat. There was no way he could know I was inside, right? But somehow I felt like he did. The tapping was soft, almost calm, as if he was testing to see if I'd react. I couldn't stand it anymore. I grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and moved toward the window, not daring to get too close. The tapping continued, each tap sending another wave of panic through my body. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't bring myself to make a sound. Finally, the tapping stopped. For a brief moment, I thought maybe he had left. I tried to breathe, tried to think logically, but when I looked out the window again, he was gone. I stood there in the kitchen, frozen, waiting for something to happen. I wanted to check the front door, but the idea of being close to the entrance made me feel like I was going to lose control. I grabbed my phone again, hoping for a signal. Nothing. That's when I heard it. A scraping noise. It came from the back door. My blood ran cold. I knew instantly that someone was trying to get inside. It was the same door that led to the kitchen. The noise was soft at first, but it grew louder. The handle clicked, and I could hear the faint sound of metal scraping against metal. I ran to the living room, trying to stay as quiet as possible, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. I barely had the strength to speak, but this time, to my relief, the call finally went through. My voice trembled as I quickly explained what was happening. I didn't care if the dispatcher thought I was overreacting. I needed help. My heart was hammering in my chest. By the time the cops arrived, the man was gone. I don't know how long I stood there in that house, waiting. The officers checked the yard, the street, even the trees near the fence, but there was no sign of him. No footprints, no traces of anything unusual. The back door was locked again, as if nothing had happened. They told me I was probably just imagining things. Maybe a drunk wandered off the road, they said, but I didn't believe them. I knew what I'd seen. I knew what I'd felt. Rachel came home later, but I didn't say much to her. I just wanted to leave. I haven't gone back to that house since, and every time I drive by, I can't help but glance over at the windows, wondering if he's still out there, waiting. I'll never forget the feeling of someone lurking just outside the dark. When I first moved into my new place, I didn't really give much thought to my morning jogs. I was fresh off a big move to a quiet suburban neighborhood in Texas, and I wanted to get back in shape after months of packing and unpacking. It was early, usually just as the sun was starting to rise and the streets were empty. Perfect conditions, right? The house was located on the edge of the neighborhood, close enough to the main road but far enough from everything else that I couldn't hear traffic or any kind of noise. It was the type of place where you could go on a run and feel like you had the whole world to yourself. I loved it. It was peaceful. There was something about the early morning air, the cool breeze, the quiet before everyone else started waking up. It gave me a sense of calm. But that calm started to shift into something else, something unsettling. At first, I didn't notice anything strange. I'd leave my house, walk down the driveway, and start my usual route through the neighborhood. I'd pass the same houses, jog past the same empty driveways, and eventually loop around to come back. No one was ever around that early, so I'd have the streets to myself, and it was always a peaceful run. But after a couple of weeks, I started feeling like someone was watching me. It wasn't a constant feeling, more like a quick flash of paranoia that would hit when I turned a corner or when I passed a particular street. It would come and go, and I thought it was just my imagination. After all, I was out there in the dark by myself. Maybe I was just being too cautious, but it kept happening. I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, even though I'd never see anyone. Or sometimes when I was jogging past a house, I'd feel eyes on me, like someone was standing at their window, watching me pass by. I'd try to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing, maybe just some other early riser starting their day. But deep down, the feeling didn't sit right. Then one morning, it escalated. I was about halfway through my run, around the block that had a row of trees lining the street. It was one of those quiet stretches, no houses on that side of the road, just empty space and tall grass. I was pushing through, trying to pick up the pace when I felt it. Someone was definitely behind me. At first, I thought it was just another runner or maybe someone walking their dog. But when I glanced over my shoulder, I saw no one. The street was empty. I didn't hear any footsteps either. Still, the feeling was undeniable. It was as if someone had just appeared out of nowhere and was now following me, just close enough that I could feel them, but not enough for me to see them. I picked up my pace, trying to shake it off, but the feeling stayed. It was like I was being hunted. But I couldn't figure out who or what was doing the hunting. The next morning, I woke up at the same time and set out for another jog, trying to push the uneasy feeling from the day before out of my mind. But this time I couldn't ignore it. The whole run felt wrong. I started noticing things. A car driving by a little too slowly, a shadow moving across a window as I passed, but no one was out on the sidewalks. Still, that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. It wasn't until about a week later, when the sun had barely started to come up, that it hit me. Someone was definitely following me. I had just turned the corner at the end of my street when I heard footsteps behind me. Unmistakable this time. I didn't even have to look over my shoulder to know someone was there. The footsteps were too loud and too consistent. They were keeping pace with me, just a few steps behind. My stomach dropped. I told myself it could be anyone, maybe just a jogger, but I could tell by the rhythm of the footsteps that they were matching mine. Whoever it was deliberately staying behind me. I quickened my pace, trying to outrun them, but they matched me. I was breathing harder now, looking ahead at the empty road in front of me, desperately hoping the footsteps would stop. But they didn't. I glanced behind me and my heart skipped a beat. There was a man jogging a few feet behind me. He was dressed in all black, sweatshirt, sweatpants, the whole deal. His face was partially obscured by the hood of his sweatshirt, but I could see enough of it to tell he wasn't smiling. He looked like he was just staring at me. I didn't know what to do. I thought about stopping and asking him what the hell he was doing, but something in my gut told me that would be a bad idea. I couldn't explain it, but I felt a chill running up my spine. I tried to turn a corner hoping he wouldn't follow, but when I glanced behind me, he was still there, following me at the same pace. My heart started racing, and I broke into a full sprint, adrenaline flooding my system. I could hear him behind me, still matching my every step. At that point, I was panicking. I couldn't outrun him. He was too fast, and I was already winded from the jog. I knew I had to get somewhere safe, but all I could think about was getting to a more populated area where someone could help if I needed it. I turned another corner and saw a small group of people coming out of a house, walking their dogs. I sprinted toward them, desperate for some kind of safety, but as soon as I reached them, I turned around. He was gone. The man had disappeared. There was no sign of him anywhere. I walked back to my house, my heart still pounding. I hadn't seen him at all after that last turn, and when I looked around, the street was empty again. But that feeling stayed with me. The feeling that something was wrong, that I had been followed. I didn't tell anyone about it. I didn't want to sound crazy. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just another case of someone out for a jog. But deep down, I knew I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being targeted. A few days later, it happened again. But this time, it was worse. I was running down the same stretch of road when I spotted him again. The same man. This time, he wasn't even trying to pretend he wasn't following me. He was walking directly behind me, not even trying to jog or keep up with me. He was moving slowly, deliberately. That's when I knew I wasn't just imagining things. This man had been following me for weeks, waiting for the right moment to get closer. And now it seemed like he was planning something. I didn't even think. I turned around and ran straight for home, hoping he wouldn't catch me. My heart was pounding in my chest. As I reached my street, I saw him quicken his pace behind me, but I reached my front door just in time and slammed it shut. I called the police, but when they came to check the area, there was no sign of him. Still, I couldn't shake the fear that he was still out there, watching me. The next morning, I stayed inside, not daring to step out of the house. That's when I got the call. The police had found the man. They caught him in the neighborhood, and after a brief struggle, they arrested him. They found out he'd been following me for weeks. Turns out, he was a local who had been targeting new residents in the area. He'd been waiting for the perfect moment to corner someone, and I had been the one he chose. He later admitted he had been watching me for days, picking up on my jogging routine, waiting for me to be alone. He was arrested. He had been stalking me the entire time. I never ran alone again after that. Every time I think back to those early mornings, I remember that feeling. The feeling that I was being watched. It's a feeling I can't shake, even now. The thought that someone was out there waiting for me is a thought I'll never forget. My dog, a big, stubborn German Shepherd named Diesel, has always been pretty laid back. He'll bark if he hears something odd, but it's usually nothing. But this night, he was going absolutely crazy. It had been a pretty normal evening until the storm hit. It started out as just a few rumbles of thunder off in the distance, and I wasn't too worried. But before long, it turned into one of those heavy Texas storms that comes in fast and you can barely see past the rain. The wind was picking up too, and the whole place felt heavy, you know? It was the kind of storm that makes you stay inside, put on some music, and forget about the world. I was on the couch trying to watch a movie, but with Diesel barking nonstop, I couldn't focus. At first, I thought maybe he was just reacting to the storm, which he did sometimes. But as the minutes passed, his barking got more frantic, more insistent. He kept running back and forth from the sliding door to the kitchen, looking at me, then back at the window that faces the backyard. I figured he just saw something, a raccoon, maybe, or one of the neighbor's cats. But it was driving me nuts. Finally, I decided I'd go check it out. I grabbed a flashlight and walked over to the sliding door. Diesel was staring at the door now, whining and pawing at the glass like he wanted to get out. I opened the door a crack, and that's when the wind hit me. It was that wet, cold kind of wind that stings against your skin. "Diesel, stop," I muttered under my breath, but he wouldn't calm down. I figured I'd do a quick check and then go back inside. So I stepped out onto the porch, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark, the rain hitting me sideways. The backyard was just as dark as I remembered. Our backyard is kind of secluded, with a tall wooden fence and a bunch of trees that block the view from the street. But there's a small patch of grass in the corner where the fence isn't as high. I always hated that spot. It just felt like anyone could hide there and watch the house, especially with the trees shaking in the wind. I shone the flashlight toward that corner and I froze. I thought I saw something move, but I wasn't sure. It was dark and the rain was making everything harder to see. But then Diesel barked again, louder this time. He was still inside, but his bark sounded almost urgent, like he was trying to warn me. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, my stomach twisted. Maybe it was just the storm messing with my nerves, but I had a bad feeling. My instincts were telling me something was wrong. I aimed the flashlight toward the corner of the yard again and took a few steps forward. And that's when I saw it. There was a figure crouched low in the bushes just beyond the tree line. I couldn't make out any details at first, just a vague shape in the darkness. But the beam of the flashlight caught something. Shiny. A glint of metal. I immediately froze. My heart started racing, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move at all, just stayed there, perfectly still, like he was waiting. I could barely make out the shape of a knife in his hand. The blade reflected the faint light of the flashlight, and it sent a jolt of pure fear through my chest. My mind raced. What was he doing? Why wasn't he running away? He had to know I saw him. The rational part of me was screaming to just go inside and lock the door, but my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, the flashlight trembling in my hand. And then the man shifted. It wasn't a big movement, just a slight turn of his head, but I could tell he was looking right at me. His eyes weren't visible, but the way he tilted his head toward me, it was like he was studying me, sizing me up. I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt like I might faint or throw up. Finally, I snapped out of it. I turned and bolted for the door, slamming it shut behind me, my hands shaking as I locked it. Diesel was barking like crazy inside, and I just stood there, trying to catch my breath, my mind reeling. I grabbed my phone and called 911, my hands still shaking. I barely managed to get the words out. I told them everything, the man in my backyard, the knife, how scared I was. They told me to stay inside, lock all the doors, and they'd send someone over. I felt like an idiot for not calling sooner. I mean, why hadn't I just trusted my gut from the start? About 15 minutes later, the police arrived. They did a quick sweep of the area, but the man was gone. I don't know how long he had been there, but the whole thing felt like a nightmare. I was relieved when the cops left, but part of me still didn't feel safe. I'll never ignore Diesel when he's barking like that again. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't checked the backyard. It was supposed to be a weekend of fun, just a break from the grind. My friends, my cousin Aaron, had been planning this camping trip for months. We were all in our mid-20s, still young, still riding that wave of carefree energy, thinking we could take on whatever the woods threw at us. None of us were seasoned campers, but we figured we'd be fine. How hard could it be? We'd be in a state park in Texas, after all. Known for its stunning views, crystal clear water, and peaceful hiking trails. The kind of place where you'd expect to just relax and let everything else fade away. We set up camp by the creek, just on the outskirts of the main trails, in a spot that seemed perfect. The sound of running water was soothing, and the air felt fresh, at least for now. We spent the afternoon lounging, having a few drinks, and talking. Everything felt easy. My cousin Aaron was always the more outdoorsy type, the one who'd wander off on his own, curious about the land. It wasn't unusual for him to take off for a hike or explore the area on foot. He'd already been down to the stream a couple of times, taking in the scenery, checking out the water. That evening, he decided to head back to the creek to get water for cooking. It was about 6 p.m., still light out, but the shadows of the trees were stretching longer, the sky dimming slowly. The plan was simple. He'd fill up his water bottle at the stream, be back in 15 minutes, and we'd start cooking dinner. He'd done it a dozen times before without issue, but he didn't come back. We waited. At first, it wasn't anything unusual. We were all chatting, laughing, enjoying the evening. Time always seems to move faster when you're with friends. But as the sun started dipping lower in the sky, the minutes stretched into half an hour, then 40 minutes. And still, Aaron didn't return. I glanced around at the others. Their faces were starting to reflect the same unease I was feeling. Maybe he's just taking longer than he thought, I said, trying to convince myself as much as them. But another 15 minutes passed, and that weird feeling, the one you can't quite explain, started settling in. It was the kind of feeling you get when you notice something's off, but you're not sure what it is yet. I looked up at the sky. Dusk had fallen, and the woods around us had grown quiet, too quiet. The usual rustle of leaves, the calls of birds, the hum of insects, they were all gone, replaced by a kind of oppressive stillness. "Aaron's been gone a while," Tyler said. He was always the pragmatic one, calm in situations where the rest of us might panic. "Shouldn't we go check on him?" I didn't need convincing. I grabbed my flashlight, and without saying much more, we all started walking toward the creek. The path was familiar, the way we had come earlier. But now, with the sun almost fully gone and the air cooling down, the woods felt different. The trees loomed over us, casting long shadows that made everything feel just out of reach. The further we walked, the heavier the air felt. The silence had become oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. It wasn't a far walk, maybe 10 minutes at most. But when we reached the creek, everything felt wrong. The water babbled peacefully, just as it had before, but there was no sign of Aaron. His water bottle was lying on a rock by the edge, but there were no footprints in the mud leading away from it. No sign of him at all. I felt that familiar twinge of unease, the feeling you get when you know something's not right, but you can't place it. We searched the area, calling his name, hoping he'd pop out from behind a tree, maybe laughing at us for worrying. But nothing. No Aaron. Tyler suggested we split up, cover more ground. So we did. We scoured the area along the creek, checking the small trails leading deeper into the woods. I don't know why I didn't feel the need to call for help sooner. Maybe I was just stubborn, or maybe part of me thought Aaron would turn up, like always. But the deeper we went, the more the knot in my stomach twisted. I called out his name again. Nothing. Another 30 minutes passed. We didn't find any tracks, no broken branches, no signs of him anywhere. It was like he had just vanished. I didn't want to admit it, but the creeping fear started to sink in. Something was wrong, and we weren't getting closer to figuring it out. We had no choice but to turn back. When we made it back to camp, I could feel the weight of the night pressing in around us. The fire we had left burning was now just a faint glow, and the forest around us had grown darker, somehow colder. It wasn't until we were back at the campsite that I realized how much time had passed. Hours. "I'll call the rangers," I said, pulling out my phone, my hands trembling more than I wanted to admit. I dialed the number for the park rangers. It felt like an eternity before they picked up. When they assured me they were sending someone out, I tried to hold on to the tiny shred of hope that maybe Aaron had gotten lost. Maybe he was just too far from camp, disoriented, but I knew deep down something worse had happened. Then, just before dawn, when I was starting to lose hope entirely, We found him. It wasn't the Rangers who showed up. It was Aaron. We'd been scanning the rocky outcrop near the edge of the creek, barely able to make out the details in the dim light of early morning. I was about to call out again when I saw him. He was hunched behind a large boulder, his knees drawn to his chest, shivering uncontrollably. His face was ghostly pale, his eyes wide and darting around like he was seeing something none of us could. When he saw me, his eyes filled with a kind of desperate relief. "Aaron!" I shouted, running toward him. He didn't move at first, just stared at me as if he wasn't sure I was real. When I reached him, he grabbed my arm like it was a lifeline. His grip was so tight it hurt. I thought it was you," he stammered, his voice shaking. "I kept hearing footsteps, but they weren't yours. Someone was chasing me." I tried to keep my voice steady. "Who, Aaron? Who was chasing you?" He just shook his head, his eyes scanning the shadows, his breath ragged. "I don't know. Some guy. He had a knife. I thought he was gonna..." I didn't know what to think. None of it made sense. There was no one else out there. Not in the area, not on the trails. And the Rangers had just arrived minutes before we found him. Where had this person been hiding? Why hadn't we heard any of this? But Aaron wasn't done. He was visibly shaking now, his body trembling like a leaf in the wind. "I thought he was going to kill me," he whispered. We all tried to comfort him, but it didn't seem to help. His fear was palpable, like a tangible thing hanging in the air between us. The Rangers immediately went to work, retracing Aaron's steps. They looked around the creek, checked the woods, and even scoured the paths we'd walked earlier. But there was nothing. No sign of anyone, no footprints, no weapon. Just nothing. Aaron was insistent. Someone had followed him, he said. He had heard the footsteps getting closer, felt the presence of someone right behind him, a threat he couldn't escape. But despite our best efforts to find evidence, we came up empty. The only clue we found were his own tracks leading down the trail to the water, but they stopped abruptly. It was as if he'd bolted, suddenly terrified. We left the park that morning with more questions than answers. Aaron was still shaken, but insisted that he hadn't imagined it. The strange thing was, none of us could remember hearing anything out of the ordinary. No footsteps, no voices, nothing that would have alerted us to what Aaron had been going through. Tyler suggested we stay another day, try to figure it out. But Aaron, still pale and visibly shaken, refused. "I can't stay here. I just need to leave," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It didn't take much for the rest of us to agree. We packed up and left, cutting the trip short, not even finishing what we had originally come for. To this day, Aaron won't go back to that spot. He says whatever was out there, whatever was chasing him, was real. He says the fear he felt that night, the way something unseen was waiting for him in the dark, will never leave him. And honestly, I don't think I'll ever forget it either. I don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was a person who got too close to the camp. Maybe it was something else entirely. But the whole thing still gives me chills. There's just something about the woods that feels wrong sometimes, something I can't explain. And I've never gone camping there again. When I first moved into my house, everything felt perfect. It was quiet. Pretty typical for the kind of area you'd find in a small Texas town. You know the type. Suburban streets lined with neat houses, green lawns, and kids riding bikes. The kind of place where nothing ever really goes wrong, where everyone knows each other and waves when they pass. I moved in last summer after I got a new job, and it was my first time living alone, so naturally I was looking forward to the peace and privacy. The house wasn't anything special. A 2-story with a small front yard and a decent backyard. It was old but well kept. The kind of place you'd expect to find in a family-oriented neighborhood. Nothing too fancy, but good enough for me. I didn't think twice when I signed the lease. But then, the door. I remember the first time I noticed it. It was maybe 2 weeks after I moved in. I'd gotten home from work. It was a late evening, maybe around 9 p.m., and as I walked up to the front door, I saw something strange. There were small, deep scratches along the lower half of the door, and not just one or two. There were a lot of them. I could tell someone had tried to pry the door open, maybe with something sharp or a tool of some kind. I was confused, wondering if it was a mistake or maybe a neighbor's kid messing around. But I figured it was probably just some harmless prank. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I tried to ignore it, but as the days passed, the scratches on the door didn't go away. In fact, they seemed to get worse. They were more dense now, like someone had been trying to get in for real, not just a random scratch. And the more I looked at it, the more I started to feel this creeping unease, like I was being watched. The front porch light never worked right. It flickered sometimes, casting weird shadows on the ground. But I didn't think too much of it. Stuff like that happens in older houses. I figured it was just a faulty bulb or wiring. But when I stepped out the next evening and noticed more marks on the door, this time closer to the handle, I started getting nervous. I called the landlord about the door, asking if he could come by to take a look, but he was always too busy. And the best he could offer was, "It's probably just the wind." I didn't want to push him, but it didn't make sense. These scratches weren't from the wind. One night I was sitting in the living room watching TV and eating some takeout when I heard a knock. Just one quick, sharp knock on the door. It was so sudden I nearly jumped out of my seat. I turned off the TV and stood there in silence for a moment, listening. The knock came again. I was instantly on edge. There was no reason for anyone to be at my door at that time. It was 10:30 p.m. I hadn't invited anyone over, and I didn't know a single person in the area well enough to just drop by. I stood at the door, peering through the peephole. All I could see was a shadow standing on the other side. I didn't open the door. I didn't even say anything. I just stood there, heart pounding in my chest, listening to my own breath. The knock came again. Then I heard something else. A low scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across the wood of my door. My blood ran cold. Whoever it was didn't knock anymore. They were just scraping. The sound was slow, deliberate, and unnerving. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up and my hands were shaking as I backed away from the door. I didn't know what to do. My phone was on the coffee table across the room, so I grabbed a nearby chair and held it close, just in case I needed to defend myself. The scraping continued for a while, and eventually I heard footsteps retreating into the night. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about those scratches, the dents in my door, and that awful scraping noise. Was it someone trying to break in? Was I being targeted? The idea of someone messing with me, someone knowing my door and my house so well, made me feel sick to my stomach. The next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always near, like I was being followed or watched. I checked the door multiple times, and the scratches had deepened, the dents more pronounced. It almost looked like someone was working at it, trying to get inside. And then it happened again. One night, I woke up at around 2 a.m. I'm not sure why. I just suddenly opened my eyes and felt this weird sensation like something was wrong. I looked around my room, but everything seemed fine. The only sound was the low hum of the AC. I was about to roll over and go back to sleep when I noticed something that made my heart stop. The light from the hallway outside my bedroom door was on. I never left it on. My blood ran cold. I was completely frozen, my body rigid with fear, my mind racing. I slowly, carefully turned my head to glance at the bedroom door. Through the small gap between the door and the frame, I could see a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. I held my breath. The figure didn't move. It was just standing there, perfectly still, barely visible in the dim light, like it was waiting for something. Maybe for me to make a sound. Maybe for me to make a move. I stayed as still as possible, trying not to breathe too loudly. My mind was a mess of thoughts. What if it was someone breaking in? What if they had a weapon? What if they were already in my house? But then I saw it. The figure was holding something long, heavy, a crowbar. A sudden surge of panic hit me. I couldn't stay there any longer. I wasn't sure how long it had been standing there, but I knew I had to act fast. I bolted from the bed, trying not to make a sound, and rushed to the bathroom. I locked the door behind me and grabbed my phone, dialing 911. The operator answered quickly, and I could barely get the words out, but I managed to tell them I needed help, that someone was in my house with a crowbar. They said they'd send someone right away, but all I could do was wait, trembling in that small bathroom. I could hear movement outside the bathroom door, the creaking of floorboards. Someone was walking through my house. I prayed it wasn't the intruder coming for me. It felt like hours before I finally heard the sound of sirens approaching. When the police arrived, they found the man standing in the hallway, holding the crowbar. They later told me that the man was a known burglar in the area with a violent history. He had been targeting houses in the neighborhood for weeks, and when they arrested him, they found tools and gear in his truck that indicated he had been casing several homes, including mine. I don't think I've ever been as scared as I was that night. The idea that someone was standing in my doorway, waiting, ready to break into my house, it still sends chills down my spine. Now, I make sure to lock everything. Every single night, I double-check the doors, the windows, the locks. I don't care if I'm late for work. I don't care how tired I am. I don't trust my own neighborhood anymore. I'm just glad I'm alive to tell the story. I live on the outskirts of a small town in Texas, about 20 minutes from the city. It's a quiet, rural area, one of those places where the nearest neighbor is a good stretch down the road. I've always loved the isolation. It's peaceful. But sometimes when the weather turns, that peace starts to feel a little unsettling. I've always had a weird feeling before storms, like an electric hum in the air that presses against your skin. It's not something I can explain, but I know it. And that night, it was worse than usual. The clouds rolled in quickly, heavy and dark, swallowing the sky whole. The wind picked up like a freight train on the horizon, and the air was thick with that low rumble of thunder. I figured it'd be just another storm, a thunderstorm, nothing too bad, but something about it felt different. The air felt heavier, like it was holding its breath. I'd just gotten home from work around 6:30 p.m., and the house was quiet. Too quiet. The lights were off, and I could almost hear the silence pressing in from every direction. The kind of silence you get in the country, where the hum of traffic and city noise is miles away. I've lived in this house for a few years now. It's a modest 2-story with a porch that creaks whenever the wind blows. Some might find it lonely, but to me, it's home. Sure, it gets a little eerie at times, but I'm used to it. Or at least, I thought I was. I threw my bag on the kitchen counter, grabbed a frozen pizza from the freezer, and popped it in the oven. While it cooked, I flipped on the TV. The Weather Channel was showing the storm front moving in, and I heard the announcer warning of high winds, rain, and possible power outages. Just a typical Texas thunderstorm, they said. Nothing to worry about. But the lightning was getting worse. It flashed bright and sharp, lighting up the whole sky every few minutes. Thunder boomed so loud I thought the house was going to shake apart. I remember thinking, it's just a storm, nothing to be scared of. By the time I finished dinner and sank into the couch with my plate, it was 8:30 p.m. and the storm had reached its peak. The wind was howling, rattling the windows, and the rain was coming down so hard it almost sounded like sheets of metal being thrown against the house. That's when I started to feel it. That nagging, crawling sensation at the back of my neck. It's hard to explain, but it was like someone was watching me. I kept telling myself it was just the storm messing with my head, but the feeling didn't go away. Every time the wind howled louder, I felt more and more like I wasn't alone. I looked around the room. Everything was fine. I checked the front and back doors. Locked. I checked the windows. Locked. I made sure the garage door was closed. Everything in its place. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was in the house with me. Around 9 p.m., the storm had reached its worst. The wind was slamming against the walls, the rain was relentless, and the power flickered once, then came back on. It didn't seem like anything to worry about, but that sinking feeling in my stomach only deepened. It wasn't just the storm. Something was wrong. I was about to pick up my phone when I heard it. It wasn't the storm. It wasn't the wind or the thunder. It was a soft creak, the kind you only hear when someone steps on an old floorboard. It was coming from the hallway just behind me. I froze. My stomach twisted. I told myself it was nothing, that it was just the house settling. But then I heard it again, louder, a floorboard bending under pressure. Someone was in the house. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Panic surged up, but I forced myself to stay still, hoping the sound would go away. It didn't. I stood up slowly, praying that the floor wouldn't creak beneath me. My hands were shaking, and I had nothing to defend myself with except my phone. I grabbed it, checked the time, 9:15 p.m., and tried to figure out what to do. I could feel my breath coming faster, my pulse racing. I moved cautiously toward the hallway, my feet barely touching the floor, trying to make as little noise as possible. Every sound outside the storm seemed amplified, like the house was holding its breath with me. I reached the corner of the hallway and paused, trying to listen, trying to figure out if the sound was still there. Then I heard it. A door. A creak. The door to my bedroom. I couldn't move. My feet felt like they were glued to the floor. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen. I could hear soft footsteps coming from the bedroom, slow and deliberate. I could feel my heart in my throat now, pounding so hard it almost hurt. I was shaking so badly I couldn't keep my phone steady. But I had no choice. I had to get help. Without thinking, I bolted toward the living room and dove behind the couch. My phone was already in my hand, and I quickly dialed 911, whispering, "Someone's in my house." The operator's voice came through soft but steady. "Stay on the line. Stay hidden." I did. I stayed as still as I could, every nerve in my body screaming at me to move, to do something. But I couldn't risk it. The man, whoever he was still moving around. I could hear his footsteps pacing the house back and forth. Every time the footsteps came closer, I held my breath, hoping he wouldn't find me. I couldn't even hear the storm anymore. All I could hear was my own heartbeat racing in my chest. The seconds felt like hours. I could feel the air shift when he got too close. I thought I could almost feel his presence right behind me. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of a door opening. The front door. He was leaving. I didn't move. I stayed crouched behind the couch, my breath shallow, waiting for him to go. I couldn't risk making a sound. He was still out there. Minutes later, I heard sirens. Relief washed over me, but the man was already gone. The police arrived shortly after, but they didn't find him. He'd already slipped away in the storm. They told me something about how thieves often strike during bad weather, using the storm as cover to move undetected. They told me to take extra precautions from now on, to lock every door, every window, to install cameras or an alarm system, things I'd never thought I'd need living in the middle of nowhere. I still check the locks several times before bed, and I know now that when the storm comes, it's not just nature you need to watch out for. I've always been one of those people who feels most at home in nature. The peace, the stillness, it's like the world gets a little quieter out there. No noise, no distractions, just me and the wilderness. I'd been on plenty of solo hiking trips, but something about this one felt different. A few months ago, I decided to go solo again, but this time I planned it for Big Bend National Park in Texas, specifically the Chizos Mountains. I'd been there a few times before, but it had always been with a group. This time, I wanted to experience it on my own. I didn't think much about it at the time, just wanted some time to clear my head, escape from the noise of everyday life. I set out late in the afternoon, which in hindsight wasn't the best idea, but I didn't realize how quickly daylight would fade in the mountains. After parking at the trailhead, I started my hike. My boots crunched against the dry dirt as the sun sank lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the rocky trail. The air smelled like dust and wild sage. The trail wasn't too hard, but it wasn't exactly flat either. It climbed steadily, winding through scattered trees and shrubs, offering occasional glimpses of the surrounding desert. The silence of the mountains was almost oppressive. It felt like the kind of place where, if you were alone for too long, you could lose yourself. But I was used to the quiet. It didn't bother me at first. If anything, it felt peaceful. By the time I reached a clearing near a small creek, the sun was nearly gone, leaving only a thin strip of orange and purple on the horizon. I hurriedly set up camp, eager to get the fire going and cook up something warm. The creek bubbled nearby, its sound like a natural lullaby, and I felt a sense of calm settle over me as I ate. But as the darkness deepened, something changed. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. It wasn't anything obvious, no loud sounds, no sudden movements, nothing that would have immediately set off alarms. But there was this odd sensation, a prickling feeling in the back of my mind, like I was being watched. It was so subtle, I almost brushed it off. Maybe I was just getting paranoid from being out here alone, or maybe it was the wind playing tricks on me. I'd read plenty of stories about the mountains making people feel uneasy, so I figured it was nothing. But the feeling didn't go away. I kept glancing over my shoulder, trying to shake it off. I told myself it was just nerves. After all, I had a few miles of solitude ahead of me before I would meet anyone else on the trail. There had been no sign of people when I started out, and this area, while beautiful, was a little more remote. People didn't usually camp here. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't like someone was right behind me, but it felt like I wasn't the only one in the woods anymore. After a while, I decided to stretch my legs, maybe walk along the creek for a bit. I grabbed my flashlight and started down the narrow path that paralleled the water. As I walked, I noticed something strange in the dirt. Footprints. At first, I thought they were mine, but as I took a closer look, I realized they were much larger. The shape was different too. Instead of the tread pattern of my boots, these were heavier, deeper, like someone with big boots or hiking shoes, and there were a lot of them. I stopped dead in my tracks. The footprints weren't going anywhere in particular. They didn't lead to the creek. They didn't lead to my camp. They were just there, scattered in the dirt, some fresh, some slightly faded. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. It could have been another hiker. After all, it was a popular trail, but I hadn't seen anyone that day. I'd been walking for hours, and the only signs of life I'd encountered were a few birds and some squirrels. My heart started to race, and I instinctively looked over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched was back, stronger this time. Like invisible eyes were on me. I tried to push it out of my head. Maybe it was just some random person who had passed through earlier. Maybe it was a ranger. But I hadn't heard a vehicle or seen any signs of anyone else on the trail, so it didn't make sense. And this was a remote area. Rangers didn't usually patrol here. I turned back toward my camp, my legs suddenly heavy as I walked. The sun was dipping below the horizon, and the temperature had started to drop. I hurried back to my tent, built up the fire a little, and tried to focus on the warmth. As the shadows stretched long across the clearing, I couldn't ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't just the footprints. It was something more, a primal instinct that told me I was being watched from somewhere in the darkness. The fire crackled, and I tried to distract myself by cooking dinner, but my mind kept racing. I couldn't shake the idea that someone or something was out there. By the time the sun had fully set, the mountain air had become chill, and the stars above were so bright they almost hurt to look at. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and lay down, trying to calm my thoughts. But sleep wouldn't come. Every rustle of leaves outside my tent made my heart skip. Every distant snap of a branch made me jump. Eventually, I drifted off, but it didn't last long. Something woke me. Some tiny noise in the distance, some disturbance in the air. I'm not sure what it was. But my eyes snapped open, and I lay there in the dark, frozen. My breathing was shallow, and my mind raced. The feeling was back. That terrible sensation of being watched. I lay still, listening. The wind had picked up, but it wasn't the wind that made my skin crawl. It was the footsteps. At first, they were faint, like distant echoes from the darkness. Slowly, they grew closer, crunching in the dirt, a slow, deliberate pace. I held my breath, straining to hear, trying to place where they were coming from. They were getting closer. Whoever it was, they were walking straight toward my tent. I was paralyzed. Every muscle in my body felt locked in place. I didn't want to move, didn't want to make a sound. But I also knew I couldn't just lay there and wait. I couldn't risk whatever or whoever was out there getting any closer. I grabbed my trekking pole from the corner of the tent, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. Holding it tight, I waited. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent, and the air went still. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, thudding like a drum. The silence was deafening, but I could have sworn I heard the faintest sound, a breath maybe, or the rustle of clothing. And then it came, the unmistakable sound of something sharp scraping against the back of my tent. The noise was slow, methodical, like someone was using a knife or a rock to cut through the fabric. I felt my stomach drop. My heart pounded in my chest as the scraping continued, each sound like a hammer striking metal. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My body was frozen in terror. I didn't know who or what was on the other side of that tent, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't just wait around. I acted without thinking. With a trembling hand, I thrust my trekking pole toward the noise. The fabric of the tent bulged, and the scraping stopped instantly. Without wasting another second, I scrambled out of the tent, yanking the zipper open and pushing my way into the cold night air. But there was no one. No person, no figure, no trace of anyone. I stood there in the dark, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The only thing I could hear was the pounding of my heart. I looked around frantically. There were more footprints in the dirt, leading away from my tent, disappearing into the shadows. I didn't stay long enough to see where they went. I grabbed my gear, packed everything up as quickly as I could, and started down the trail. The mountain path, which had seemed so peaceful just hours ago, now felt like a maze of danger. My mind raced with every step I took, constantly checking over my shoulder, but I didn't dare look back. The trail seemed longer than it had before. The darkness pressed in around me. The stars above offered no comfort. They only reminded me of how alone I felt. I didn't care about the trail anymore. Didn't care about the rocks beneath my boots or the wind whispering through the trees. I just wanted to get out. I didn't stop until I was out of the Chisos Mountains and back at my car. Since then, I've never returned to Big Bend. I still hike, but I always go with someone else. And every time I step into the woods, I can't help but wonder if someone is out there watching. I don't know who or what was out there that night. But I do know one thing: I'll never go back to find out. It was last summer when it all started. Matt and I had been planning this trip for months, ever since we'd come back from that last camping adventure. The spot we chose was one we'd been to a few times before, a small, isolated lake nestled deep in the woods. We'd always remembered it as a place where we could truly get away, peaceful, quiet, with the soft lapping of water against the shore and a backdrop of towering pines and maples. It was the kind of place you could lose yourself in just for a few days, the kind of place you'd go to unplug. We'd been there together a couple of years ago, and the memories had always stayed with us. No crowds, no distractions, just the two of us, the forest, and the water. It was supposed to be the same this time. A quiet weekend of fishing, hiking, and long nights by the fire. No interruptions, just us. The second night after dinner, I found myself itching for a quiet moment. I'd brought my camera along, eager to capture the last bits of daylight before the sun sank behind the mountains. The sky was glowing with that rich orange hue, like the whole world had been dipped in honey, and I thought it would make the perfect shot. Matt, as usual, was by the fire. He was poking at the embers, the faint crackle of the leftover coals filling the air. His earphones plugged in as he scrolled through his phone, probably lost in some playlist or podcast. "You coming?" I called out to him. "The sunset's perfect." "Nah, I'm good." Matt waved me off, his eyes still glued to the screen. "Go have fun with your camera. I'll be fine here." So I grabbed my gear, my old Nikon, and set off toward the shoreline. The path to the lake was familiar. The forest around us was thick, but the path was well worn, a comforting trail we'd walked countless times before. But tonight something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. It was the air, I think. The way it clung to you, thick and heavy. The usual evening breeze had died down completely, and the trees were unnervingly still, like the whole place was holding its breath. I figured it was just the calm before the sunset, but still, something nagged at me. As I made my way toward the water's edge, I stopped for a moment to take in the view. The sky was painted in shades of crimson and violet, and the reflection of the fading sunlight shimmered in the still water. I snapped a few pictures, adjusting my settings, trying to capture the perfect angle, but the longer I stood there, the more the silence settled in around me. There wasn't a single bird call or rustle of wildlife, just the soft lapping of the water at my feet. I glanced at my phone. It had been longer than I thought. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the woods were starting to darken around me. Time to head back, I thought. I turned to retrace my steps, but something hit me immediately. I couldn't see the campfire. The glow of it, the warm flicker I had expected to find through the trees, wasn't there. No big deal, I thought. The path's familiar. I'll be fine. Except there was no path. I stopped and squinted into the dimming light. What was going on? I took a few steps forward, assuming I had veered off course somehow. But everything looked different. The trees were denser here, their trunks dark and twisted, shadows stretching long across the ground. I thought I saw the faintest outline of the firelight, but when I walked toward it, it was just more trees, more darkness. I started to call out, "Matt? Hey, where are you?" But the words felt weak in the heavy silence, like they didn't belong. They echoed back at me from all directions, swallowed up by the thick air. No reply, no sound at all except for the faint rustle of leaves, stirred by a breeze that didn't feel like it belonged in the stillness of the woods. Matt was always messing with me, disappearing for a bit just to freak me out, but this felt different. It was too quiet. No sign of him, no sign of the fire, no sound of the forest. It was like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I tried to stay calm. No need to panic. I was fine. But the longer I walked, the more I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, their branches looming over me like dark sentinels. I couldn't hear the usual sounds of the forest. No creaking of the branches, no chirping of insects, nothing. Just my own footsteps crunching against the dry leaves. I pulled my phone out, but of course there was no signal. I cursed under my breath. Not even a bar. Panic started to creep in, cold and insidious. What if something happened to Matt? What if I'd wandered too far? But then, through the trees, I saw it. A flicker of light. It was dim, almost faint, but it moved. It was there, then gone, like someone was waving a flashlight. Relief flooded through me. "Matt!" I called out, louder this time. "Matt, is that you? I'm lost, man." My voice cracked, desperate. The light didn't flicker or move any closer, though. I stepped forward, my feet crunching in the dry underbrush, but it didn't come any closer. It was too far and the trees were thick. But I kept walking toward it, convinced that it was him, that the light would lead me back to the camp. But then, just as I thought I was close enough to reach it, the light stopped. Just stopped, as if someone had turned it off. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest. This isn't right. I stood there in the dark, staring at the place where the light had been, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound. And then, with a sickening certainty, I watched the light go out. Just like someone had flipped a switch. I couldn't explain it. It made no sense. My stomach twisted, but still, I couldn't turn back. I didn't want to believe it. I kept moving toward the spot, hoping I'd find Matt, laughing at me for being so gullible. But when I got there, there was nothing. Just cold air, stillness, and the weight of something invisible pressing against me. I kept walking, faster now. The silence felt oppressive. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing together like they were alive. It was suffocating. I could hear my breath coming in ragged gasps, and the more I walked, the harder it became to keep my footing. My pulse was pounding in my ears. I felt watched. And then, like a cruel joke, I saw it. A soft, steady glow in the distance, just ahead. But this wasn't a flashlight. This was something else, an orange-yellow light that seemed to rise from the ground itself, flickering like the embers of a dying fire. I didn't want to look. I knew I shouldn't, but my legs moved before my brain could catch up. I stepped forward, trying to ignore the icy chill creeping down my spine, praying that it would lead me back to camp. But when I got closer, I froze. It was just a pile of rocks. A small circle of stones arranged in the shape of a fire pit. No fire, no warmth, just that eerie, unnatural glow. My stomach churned. Panic surged through me, and before I could process what was happening, I turned and ran. I didn't even think about it. I just sprinted, pushing through the brush, tripping over roots, tearing at my skin with the sharp branches. And then finally, through the trees, I saw it. The campfire. The familiar, flickering orange light. I stumbled toward it, gasping for breath, my legs heavy as lead. I felt like I'd been running for hours. Matt was sitting by the fire, just like I'd left him, relaxed, unbothered, his phone still in his hands. "Dude, where the hell have you been?" he asked, barely looking up from his screen. "Thought you were taking pictures." I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, my heart still racing. "Matt, have you been messing with me? I've been out there for ages. I couldn't find my way back, and I thought I saw you with a flashlight." Matt looked at me, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What?" "I've been here the whole time. Never moved. I figured you were just out taking photos." I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. Something in the air had shifted. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing that light flickering in the distance. I still don't know what happened, and every time I think back to that trip, I get this cold feeling like something or someone is still out there, watching. To this day, I don't go near that place. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.